Hello, and welcome to live programming here at the More Freedom Foundation. This week, a number of things went wrong. We had sort of some technical difficulties at the studio I've been shooting at recently. That studio is also known as Mom and Dad's place. We had a 3-day blackout, so filming got a little messed up. I also got a little more intensely into writing the book, Avoiding the British Empire, that I've been working on. So there is no produced video for this week, so we're going to go live. But I'm actually kind of excited about what I am going to be doing today, because the amount of writing I've been doing this week and some other recent events have kind of crystallized some things for me. They've sort of gotten some things to stick in my head that are actually about some sort of broader ideas of what this channel is about. This is what I'm going to do today, is going to kind of attempt to explain a lot, in history, geopolitics, sort of what's going on, morality, this, that, and the other thing. I've got a prepared presentation, or rather sort of an outline to work through. This could be an unholy mess, but I think it could also be very interesting. So I can't wait to see what you guys think of this. For those who might be new to this, what happens with this live chat format is I'll generally work through an outline that, just talking myself, which will last anywhere from 15 minutes to sometimes as long as an hour. And then I'll dive into the comments here on the right and start answering questions. There'll be a Q&A period about half an hour to an hour from now. I encourage you to dive into the comments, say hello to everybody, interact. Please don't be abusive of anybody other than myself. You're perfectly free to be as abusive as me as you want. Somebody pointed out the last time we did this, there were super chats. People had attached super chats to some questions that I had missed, which is, I understand, a big faux pas. I'm new to this whole super chat idea of people like paying for chats. It's very cool. I'm grateful for any kind of support, and I'm really sorry that I missed people's questions that were connected to super chats. So if you're going to connect a question to a super chat, I absolutely want to address that. But maybe hold off in the first hour, because I'm not going to be able to scroll all the way back while also trying to interact with newer comments. So if you're going to do a super chat connected to a question, please hold that off until I start the Q&A period, because I don't want to miss one of those again, because I feel pretty bad about that. Okay, let's just sort of launch right into it. So the title of this video was sort of like a concept I was thinking a lot about last week, and it's just this sort of idea that was just sort of rocketing around in my head, and it's sort of, like killing people is a bad thing, like killing people is bad. Now that sounds kind of like something like a 5-year-old would say to a parent, like sort of like, "Mommy, why do people kill people?" Or even worse, it sounds like something like a 19-year-old like college sophomore, who's like just discovering pacifism or has smoked too much pot that month would talk about. It's not a concept that is generally respected. It's not a question that makes a lot of sense. It makes, asking that question makes people sort of think down on you. You're either an innocent or some kind of foolish person who doesn't really know what's going on, doesn't really know how the world works. In the United States, and I believe in many other countries, there's this idea that sort of foreign policy and security and defense is sort of handled by groups of sort of wise old men. And I mean, actually less and less, it's not just old men anymore, but this is sort of the classic picture, sort of those old white men in suits who really, they're the experts, and they sort of, they keep us safe. It used to be the Republicans were sort of more renowned for that sort of thing, but now the Democrats are just as aggressive, and the Republicans seem to do nothing more than get us into disastrous wars. But it used to be sort of the Republicans were the daddy party. They were the serious folks who knew how to confront the communists or this wide range of new threats that we face. So over the past really over the past 4 years, what I've looked at more than anything else is sort of like the underpinnings of these questions, the sort of idea, like, okay, like, so is the foreign policy establishment, like, are they getting it right? Like, are they basically for the past 4 years, I've been taking a look at what they have been doing, what the serious men, the experts have been doing with foreign policy and security and defense, and they have no idea what they're doing. It's like actually that 5-year-old who asks that question, who asks, like, why are we bombing people? Why are we killing people? It actually turns out that 5-year-old, or even that 19-year-old hippie, they're asking the right questions. We really don't have any justification for what we're doing. All of these threats, all of these hotspots that the U.S. government, that U.S. security experts focus on, there's just not much there other than what those U.S. security experts have created. We're constantly told that we live in this incredibly dangerous world that has to be constantly dealt with and has to be handled in a way by these serious people. And it's actually a much better world than it has been in quite some time. This may sound ridiculous, like if you pay attention to the news, but if you look at like these hotspots that are focused on Syria more than anywhere else over the past 7 years, these hotspots are completely created by the U.S. government. And yes, Syria is a horrible, horrible place, but if you compare it to the 1980s, or the 1970s, the 1960s, now we've got one Syria going on, and Yemen and sort of other places that are problematic. But in the 1980s, you had 10 Syrias going on. So it's sort of hidden from us that we're living in a much, much more peaceful world than we ever have been. And it's actually those sort of wise old men who believe that they're the ones who really should know about whether or not killing is okay. It's actually those folks who make the world a lot worse and a lot more dangerous. Now, I don't want to give the impression that this is some kind of anti-American video, or that this is an anti-American foreign policy channel. I think that the U.S. government and the U.S. foreign policy establishment is in this weird position where they're the most powerful folks. And it was not like a conscious plan on their part, not necessarily. I mean, on some people's parts, like Teddy Roosevelt, James K. Polk, some leaders really were aiming towards this sort of international primacy that the United States has, like, the whole time. But I'm not arguing for some sinister plan here on the part of the United States, or even like a special. What I'm arguing for is a kind of stupidity, a kind of blind spot in the way that U.S. foreign policy experts look at the world. And it is not just an American blind spot. It is not just this. It's not just a mistake that U.S. policy has made, and it's not just a U.S. mistake or a U.S. blind spot today. I mean, other countries have this. Unfortunately, as I'll get into, the misconception here actually tends to convince other people, other countries, to go in for it as well, both allies and competitors. It's sort of a grand illusion that we're all living through, that every country needs to have this defense department and these security people that are gonna just sort of figure out how things are. What it is it's a kind of historical hangover. This is something that has stuck with us for centuries, because this way of viewing the world that you need to have these horribly violent, expert people, figuring out how to really handle things, be serious about stuff, be serious about killing and killing others. That was true for almost all of human history. This spring, I read a book called Against the Grain by James C. Scott, and it is a disturbing book because it describes what all of human history is like, or at least all of written human history. He's sort of like part of that larger crowd that believes we were all happier as hunter-gatherers, which is not actually something I subscribe to. I don't really believe that. But what this book does is it lays out really clearly just how dark and frightening like most of life in like settled agricultural states has been, like really for about give or take, like always sort of, I feel like the date for the start of the agricultural revolution is always shifting, and it was very different in very different places. So say like for the last 10,000 years or so, like this history has been just like horrifying. You know, it really has been this sort of war of all against all. In James C. Scott's book, he'll describe how, you know, sort of a city state will rise on an agricultural basis for a while, and it'll be there for a couple hundred years. And then it'll just collapse because some other state came and took it. Some, you know, pastoral nomads came in and took everything. And then all of a sudden you have, you know, literally a 20th of the number of people living there. I mean, this was life in sort of pre-industrial times was very serious and very dangerous and horrifying, really. Like you sort of look back at that. And it's actually it's traumatizing, you know, for the societies that we live in. This just the way that life was organized back then. I've talked about before the way that like prior to industrialization and mass literacy and a bunch of other sort of technologies and approaches to things, the way that the world was organized was actually really quite straightforward. It was thugs on top, and everybody else just sort of working for those thugs, you know. And I use that term thugs like very seriously, like the people running pretty much all societies prior to mass literacy, mass representation, industrialization. You know, mass representation is impossible without industrialization and mass literacy. But prior to that, the folks running all these societies were running kind of protection rackets, sort of like gangsterism. I think a lot of this is, you know, most clearly codified in the sort of system of European feudalism. That's obviously the tradition I come from, so it's what I think of. But even before, you know, even outside of more traditionally feudal systems or whatnot, that was the way that the world was organized. You had a king or someone on top, somebody on top who promised to deliver security, to deliver defense, sort of safety and security for everybody else in, you know, in their society, in their city state, in their whatever it was, tribe, what have you. And in return, that person, that warrior elite, that person and the sort of warrior elite or aristocracy, sort of the folks on top, those people got absurd privileges over everybody else in that society. So you had a class of people on top, the class of people on top of a society, essentially forever, in human society, not just in Western society, has been a warrior elite. You know, I'm very confident you've got that in Indian society. There's sort of a warrior caste on top. Maybe there's another one on top of that, but like, you know, towards the top, you know, you've got maybe a king or a priestly class on top, and then you've got a whole bunch of warriors that have to go out and, you know, regulate. You know, they have more privileges, they have more powers, they have more freedoms. That's sort of the way most of human society has been organized forever. And that is a pretty crappy way to live, but you can see why it developed, because that's how high the stakes were. That's how dangerous life was in these sort of pre-modern societies. I mean, it was a dog eat dog thing. And the most important thing, like the sort of the fundamental unit of wealth and power in these societies was land. It was land that mattered. That's why war was such a important aspect, you know, for these sort of thugs on top, for these warrior elites. I mean, you could make a bigger army if you had more land. You know, it was a pretty straightforward function. You know, it was sort of like, it was math. If you have more land, you can have a bigger army. If you have more land, you can devote more resources to defense and security. So this would sort of make things even worse. And the warrior elites of every state and society had this incentive to fight against everybody else because that would make them more powerful. And that's the world that we still kind of live in today, even though it makes absolutely no sense. That whole like land function is broken. In most societies, we're moving away from this idea of a warrior elite oligarchy. Like all of these sort of historical things have been broken, but we haven't actually changed our behavior much. I think it's something that I'm toying with calling a historical hangover or an aristocratic hangover that we've been dealing with here. Because something did change. Something changed dramatically. And that was the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution is, I remember having a friend in college who talked about the Industrial Revolution. He was like, oh yes, the Industrial Revolution happened in 1852, which was ridiculous. I mean, the Industrial Revolution was at least a century-long process, and it's very hard to sort of point exactly where it was, what had happened, what was going on. But what we do know is that at some point in the 19th century, I suppose, more or less, or 1700s or 1800s, the sort of chart of world economic growth that had been sort of hovering around 0.01% a year forever just sort of started going like this. Went up to 1% a year, and then 2% a year, and then 3% a year. And you've got this sort of world GDP graph that just goes sort of like, it essentially hockey sticks. And that involved mechanization, that involved new uses of power, new uses of essentially everything. Basically the entire modern world that we are surrounded with was built in the past 200 years or so. And 200 years ago, most people everywhere in the world were still doing peasant farming to support a warrior elite of some sort. I mean, that's what most of the world looked like. That is really, really, really no longer the case. And the first place that sort of unlocked this, that really started putting all of these technologies and developments together in a coherent way that gave more power to their societies was Europe. Europe was the first place that sort of put all these things together. Specifically, it was more Western Europe. You had the British Empire and you had France that sort of were the leaders in this and sort of putting this together. And, not surprisingly, those two countries are still top 10 economies today, even though they're tiny compared to some of the other giants in that top 10. So it was these countries that sort of first put this all together. But that's the sad thing is they didn't really realize what they had created. They didn't realize the historical opportunity that breaking that land function provided. It really wasn't necessary anymore to go out and take lands and this, that, and the other thing. Like there was, at some points, there were aspects of the British Empire earlier on, things that they took. That were usually more related to trade routes. Like it made sense for a European empire in the 19th century to control trade routes, strategic ports here and there, this, that, and the other thing. Like that actually made a kind of sense. What absolutely did not make any sense was grabbing whole swaths of Asia and Africa. That was old thinking. That was a historical hangover, a sort of aristocratic hangover that the European empires were dealing with. They didn't realize what they had. They didn't realize that they had gotten to a point where a country could actually be rich and successful, not through grabbing other people's land, but through industrialization, through building up resources, factories, capacity within their own lands. Like this whole connection between this need to conquer your neighbor in order to advance was dissipating. Now, this sort of historical hangover that we see in Europe, this aristocratic hangover, was actually quite concretely represented in the ruling classes of those countries. Even in Britain, which actually had a sort of more representative parliament earlier on, before everybody else did, actually especially in Britain in a lot of ways, because they didn't get conquered as often, and their aristocracies didn't get slaughtered as often. Um, uh, all the way up until 1914, every country in Europe was still ruled by this hereditary aristocracy, by this old-fashioned warrior caste that that justified itself and justified its existence through war and conquest and valor and glory and all that horse shit. Like those are the people who were running Europe in the run up to World War One. Now they were definitely they weren't the medieval bruisers and knights on shining armor and vicious, brutal, nightmarish thugs that they were 500 or even 200 years before. I mean, they were much softer, they were much more wealthy, they were much more cultured and refined, or what have you. But they were still basically thugs. I mean, that was still the way they saw the world. They saw their main purpose as to go to war for their country and achieve that glory. So that's how we got both the era of imperialism and the cataclysms that were World War One and World War Two. It was this sort of aristocratic mindset. It was the if you talk about the age of European imperialism, it's that really sad fact that the first people on the planet who figured out how to get away from the old cycle of conquest and only being able to enrich yourself by killing other people, the first people who were able to do that, the Europeans, couldn't think of anything other to do than to use that new power to conquer people more effectively. And that's a damn shame. The next sort of tragedy in this sort of ongoing story of humanity not realizing what they have and the capability that they now have would be World War One and those aristocrats, those thugs on top, helping to guide their societies into World War One. I do think there's an aspect of that. I'm sort of shaping this as I go. That is a little overstated. It's different from the way that I used to think about it. What's interesting, and I think is actually a key part of this story, as we get into the 20th century and as we get into more, representative democracy type systems. You've got these thugs on top. You've got these aristocrats on top. And, honestly, for them, getting into a big war was a justification for their continued role because it was getting shakier. It just sort of just naturally, this sort of mass literacy, mass politics, mass everything tended to chip away at the privileges and the privileged position of these thugs on top. So they wanted that war, but also the broader publics in the run up to World War One. As in my reading in recent years, I've been surprised to learn is how much they wanted it too. They loved these ideas of glory. They loved these ideas of going out and crushing your enemies in the general public, not just those thugs on top, not just that warrior case. That's I think got a lot to do with sort of people's natural love of being led, natural love of being sheep, and also because the ideas, attitudes, fashions, or whatnot of these thugs on top, of these European aristocrats, sort of permeated the society. So World War One, it wasn't just the thugs on top leading Europe into disaster. It was a whole mass culture behind those folks running off in the same direction with them. And that's not to say there weren't people who opposed World War One as it was happening, not to say that there weren't people who could see what was happening. But it wasn't just the aristocrats who brought about World War One, because the publics were sort of convinced that this was worthwhile as well. And from 1914, pretty much right through 1945, with a break in there, Europe just ripped itself to shreds. It had, I guess, for those living in the non-European world, it's actually maybe even a good thing, because these folks who had first figured out how to supercharge their conquest, supercharge their taking control of the world, basically killed themselves. They sort of shot themselves in the foot. That same sort of thugs on top, aristocratic hangover, historical hangover that their societies had that allowed them to conquer the world also ended up sort of killing Europe, because these idiots just ran at each other, tore each other to shreds. And World War One, in a lot of ways, is still one of the most horrific wars the world has ever seen, which is kind of crazy 100 years later. So yeah, we get to the end of this World War II era, this sort of this horrific, just horrific disaster that Europe had imposed on itself. And one very nice thing about that is it actually did, in Europe anyway, sort of sweep out a lot of this old aristocratic mindset towards war. I've been thinking a lot recently, but I've been sort of comparing the French and the British sort of systems. It seems in Britain that there really is almost no larger support for the idea of war and whatnot. It strikes me that it's really sort of the British government's desire to brown nose the United States that keeps them with, that has them holding on to a military aspect and an aggressive foreign policy, but it's an aggressive foreign policy just sort of following the United States around and trying to be helpful. Whereas I think France still has this sort of just really primal urge to destroy, which is interesting because in the United States we associate France with sort of high-mindedness, lovely social welfare state and beautiful art and culture, but they're vicious, man. Like, just sort of looking at the United States right now is to no purpose militarizing, setting up bases in northern Syria, and the French are right there with them. Like, woohoo, let's do it. Let's they're still trying to build an empire in the 21st century, which is just idiotic. But that was sort of a long way of getting into. After the World Wars, people began to realize that this old aristocratic idea of war and glory was just evil and nuts and frankly insane. And you can see a lot of sort of hard adherence to ideas of pacifism in places like Germany, Japan, and other places in Europe and across the world. The mass public, the mass public of Europe listened to its betters, listened to the thugs on top and the nobles about the glory of war, and what it got them was mass destruction. So this idea, this justification that war is somehow glorious or worth pursuing has sort of fallen away, and that is a great thing. One of the most horrifying developments is that I see sort of aspects of that creeping back a bit in the United States with like our new reverence for generals and like all that hogwash. And that really bothers me. I mean, that bothers me deeply, but generally we're nowhere near where we would be where we were in 1914 in terms of like that, just like love of violence and war and whatnot. But what happened after World War II was the Cold War. And I think that's kind of fascinating because both the United States and the Soviet Union, excuse me, were trying to react against this old way of doing things, but they were doing so in very different ways. I mean, they were dealing with this historical hangover, this awful, terrible, thuggish way of looking at world politics that had killed millions, 100 million people in the first half of the 20th century. And had different solutions, but of course these different solutions were tremendously opposed. Whereas the United States sort of like, well, okay, if we try something that's a little more common man focused, at least, or perhaps a little more mercantile, commercial oligarchy focused than these stupid old ideas of nobility and aristocracy, then things will be fine. Whereas the Soviets were like, no, this was fucking horrible. Like, we need to rip up everything completely and try this completely new approach with, this German scientist who tells us how history is going to go, blah blah blah. Obviously, I don't have a lot of respect for the communist approach to these things, and that sort of set up this dynamic. And I do believe in the early years of the Cold War, it was a real serious conflict with existential threats for each and every side, and that's sort of what built up this this group of serious old men in the United States who are going to tell us what our national security interests are, and how things should go, and what the appropriate a response to things are, and why it's so silly of you to think that killing people is bad. That was built. This establishment was built to fight the Cold War, and there's all kinds of aspects to that. From sort of propaganda stuff to sort of like how putting together the way that other countries are viewed in our universities, media, think tanks. It's this sort of colossus that I've talked about at great detail in the sort of military industrial complex series that I have on the channel, and it's still there. It's like a zombie, and it's like it long after it had served any purpose. I think you can probably, I've been thinking about this a lot recently with the book that I'm writing. It's like, I think you can probably argue that functionally, like, the Cold War was won by the late 60s, when we figured out that China actually wasn't really allied with the Soviet Union. I think, those guys were pretty much done. But that hasn't stopped. The military industrial complex from continuing to exist, from sort of continuing to be there. Let's see. Let's get started. I'm working through my outline here. All right. So I think at this point, it probably makes sense to underline a bit more what I'm talking about and how pointless these conflicts that the United States are aiming towards is. This idea that radical Islamic terrorism is a problem is frankly nuts, because the United States created it. Like Sunni jihadi terrorism is something that the United States was funding as recently as last year in Syria. Like, we only cut our sort of humanitarian funding to northern Syria, which has been a more and more jihadi state for the past 7 years. Like, we only cut that last week. So like, for people who look at this honestly, and yeah, they're definitely, we're great people being supported by U.S. funds in northern Syria, people who deserve help and blah, 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 but they were living in places controlled by jihadis. So if you are feeding the populations of a sort of jihadi insurgent state against the government of Syria, then yes, you are supporting jihadists. And prior to last year, we were also arming those jihadists, which there is no fucking justification for. So really, throughout, from the birth of Al-Qaeda, from the birth of ISIS, not the birth, well, yeah, the birth of ISIS was inadvertently U.S. fault, but from the flourishing of ISIS in 2014, they flourished in a space that the United States created for them by trying to destroy the Syrian state with the CIA program. The whole history of terrorism, jihadi terrorism, comes from Saudi Arabia, the U.S. ally that is supposedly so important and helpful. So this whole idea that terrorism is a worthwhile threat that justifies our establishment of death-dealing devices is hogwash. This idea that Iran and North Korea are these, irrational, crazy states that are just gonna, just a moment away from flicking the switch and killing everybody. I think there's elements of that are kind of true, more with North Korea than with Iran, but there's just no thinking about this, thinking about the way that our approach to these countries has helped to create this issue. We declared war on both countries in 2002. I mean, not formally, because Congress has to do that formally, but George W. Bush got up and made a speech being like, Iraq, Iran, and North Korea are an axis of evil, and we're coming for you. And then we came for Iraq, and thankfully that went really poorly, so we didn't come for Iran or North Korea. But like, I feel like there's very little understanding of just how, and this is similar with the setup between the Soviet Union and the United States in the Cold War. It's like it becomes a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, like differing reactions to this sort of aristocratic historical hangover, this idea that the people who run a country should be out there, thugging and beating up the other guys. Like the different ways that, say, the Iranian theocrats and the United States government have reacted to this historical hangover we all share, has ended up creating this really stupid situation where it seems like you've got Iranian hardliners and US hardliners who are each other's greatest allies, while the rest of us sort of like walk around being like, what the hell is going on? Why are we still talking about this 40 years later? This is stupid. So yeah, and Russia, I mean, don't get me started on Russia. That's all NATO expansion that we promised not to do. And yes, Russia has done horrible stuff. I don't support what they've done in Ukraine, but I know why they did it, because of, once again, this historical hangover, this inability to see beyond the inherent stupidity of our approaches. Let's see here. And it's really frustrating just watching this. I mean, people sort of wondered why why I was so sort of shaken by that Gaza attack last week, and it's just because all of this is just so fucking pointless. Like, it's just so pointless. These people dying for really no good reason. They're dying because people had sort of convinced themselves that the American security state is worth preserving. As I've documented in the Medium post that I tend to send to people who start screaming Zionists at me, I think the sort of chain of causation between the U.S. and Israel is a bit fucked up. I mean, people seem to generally think that the U.S. government works for Israel, whereas actually it's the sort of more conservative and idiotic elements of the Israeli government that work for the United States, that sort of preserve this idea of an enemy in Iran, both so Israel can avoid looking at itself, and so that the United States can avoid looking at itself and the tremendous monstrosity that we've created. There is one sort of exception to my general approach, that none of the things that the United States claims are threats, and that is that is China. I do believe that China, within by the 2020s or the 2030s, will be a very serious competitor to the United States, and this is why I think what I'm talking about right now is so important, because we're now at another opportunity. We're at an opportunity like the end of World War I. At the end of World War II, and like everybody's disgust with war and violence, or at the end of the Cold War, that unfortunately ended up with George H.W. Bush going into Iraq and us really never leaving until this day. But that was another opportunity where we could sort of sit back and like recalibrate our approach to these things, and the sort of the historical hangover I've been talking about. Like, we really could have kicked back, and I think we're now at a point now where we're coming to the end of U.S. primacy, and I think it's almost certain that within the next 10 years there'll be some kind of crisis, some sort of financial or debt crisis for the United States that requires a dialing down in U.S. foreign adventuring, and I think that will provide an opportunity as well. For people to be like, hey, wait a second, like, is all this bullshit really necessary? Because that's, I guess, the central message of this talk today. This bullshit really is not necessary. But we can make it necessary. We can, if we continue to choose, if we continue to let the policymakers in the United States act as aggressively as they have done, as pointlessly aggressively as they have done for the past 16 years, before that as well, then we absolutely can get to a point where the same historical hangover that is present in our heads is also present in, the Chinese leadership's heads. And we could absolutely, I made videos earlier this month talking about how it's very, very possible to see all kinds of proxy wars and garbage. Like one of the most viciously pointless and horrific things that happened in European imperialism in the 19th century and the 1800s was what's called the Scramble for Africa. Of course, there were terrible things done throughout the rest of the world, but unlike what was done in the Americas and what was done in Asia, there was very little real justification. There were some mines here and there, some mineral wealth here and there, but they didn't need to take over the entire freaking continent of Africa to do that. And I really do think that if we continue on the current path, if we don't try to challenge this historical hangover, like we could see in the 2020s and 2030s, a new scramble for Africa between China and the United States and sort of dumbass proxy wars in the middle of nowhere. That may sound crazy, but we're already there. I was just talking with a friend of mine. He's a professor actually at a very well-regarded university yesterday. Admittedly, he's in a more sciencey field, but he's a very well-read, intelligent person. Like he follows the news. He's got very well thought out opinions. Yada yada. And we were talking about the U.S. military in Africa, and he was like, "Yeah, of course, the U.S. is in Libya, and probably bombed some stuff in Somalia." I'm like, "Nah, man. Like, the U.S. military is in, I think, something like between 20 to 25 African countries out of 54. It's there nominally for training and advising, to explain to these." African leaders how to handle all the weapons that they bought from us, which is supposedly super helpful for U.S. security somehow in some way that I can't imagine or see. And this is just training and advising, except for when we actually hear about it, it's training and advising that somehow involves. 4 U.S. Special Forces soldiers dying in Niger, a country that honestly most U.S. senators probably can't name, supposedly in a battle with ISIS, or at least in a battle with the folks that Niger's strongmen call ISIS. So yeah, we're already fighting pitched battles in African countries that very few Americans can name, let alone find on a map. And that's the sort of perniciousness of this. I think there's a misconception. Actually, I suppose for the good of the world, I'd be happy if it wasn't a misconception. But there seems to be this idea that once the United States loses power and falls out, that the rest of the world will finally be able to live in peace. And I don't actually think that's true. I think that this historical hangover that's present in the United States, this sort of hankering back for old aristocratic ideas of glory and violence and security and defense, I think that's actually present to some degree everywhere. And I do think that the sort of U.S. world system that we've got right now is kind of the best chance to grow beyond that. I could very well be wrong about that. I'm obviously very biased, but we really can get to the point where, the sentiment that is the title of this talk, "Killing People is Bad," is something that people actually agree on. It's like not just a moral statement, but also one that our governments follow. It's actually. That may sound absurd or utopian or pacifist or silly or childish or what have you, but I think it's time to start. I think it's time to start listening to the children, and the pacifists, because honestly, if you look at the amount of progress that we've already made, it's actually quite significant. It is the world is a much better place than it has ever been. The sort of world's tolerance for sort of casualties and state violence is lower than it has ever been. These are fantastic. This is fantastic progress, but we have to acknowledge that there are significant portions in all of our countries, significant constituencies that are still arguing for an older, stupider way of looking at things, that is violent, that is dangerous, and if we allow another one of these sort of Cold War style feedback loops to build up between the United States and China, it'll be, it won't be for another couple hundred years that we actually grow up as a species. And, we might have another world war in between, and that would be really fucking sad. There was this thing, I think I might make a t-shirt actually. There's this thing that keeps rocking around in my head recently, and it's sort of a slogan. It's war. War is horses. War is horses. Because if you think about horses for like all of agricultural society, like from 10,000 years ago until about 110 years ago, actually, until the past century, horses were absolutely essential for everything. For the past 5-6 months, I've been living in sort of Upper Manhattan in New York City, and there are a couple buildings here that date back prior to the time, that date back to the time of horses. And it's fascinating looking at a big apartment complex that's got a little horse carriage roundabout in front of it. We don't realize just how incredibly important horses were for freaking ever. And then they weren't. Almost immediately. Horses were absolutely essential for any kind of functioning U.S. society, horses were absolutely essential for any functioning human society. That's an overstatement, but horses were absolutely essential for certain kinds of states and societies forever, until all of a sudden they weren't at all. And I really think we're at the same point with sort of war generally. But we've got a lot of people working to make sure that doesn't happen. And I think there should be more space in our national and world conversation for ideas like this, that maybe we don't have to kill each other as much anymore. This may sound kind of ridiculous and utopian or whatnot, and you know what? It may be. It may very well be. But that doesn't mean it's a bad idea to have out there, because I don't see any of that. I just see, constant coverage of the few tiny places that there are problems, and complete ignorance of, why these issues actually happen. Because most of the reason that these issues happen today is the sort of U.S. military-industrial complex and other countries sort of working out this historical hangover I've been talking about. All right. I hope that was useful. I enjoyed going through that. I thought that was fun, and I think it helped me sort of think a little more deeply about these concepts. Do we have questions? Are there issues that have come up in the comments? There's a bit of a lag here. I think there's maybe I don't know if it's as long as a minute. But there's a lag between what I say and what gets out to people. So people aren't really going to see. Okay, here we go. Question. Logo Cool Extreme asks, what are your thoughts on the Malaysian election? And I'm very happy to answer that question. If I weren't so dived in on the British Empire and US Empire right now, I would have done some videos on the Malaysian election. And I may actually do that. I think there's at least a video, if not a larger series, in sort of what's going on. Briefly, the Malaysian election, the ruling party that has ruled Malaysia more or less since independence, I think it's UMNO, United Muslim something, lost power. It was voted out. And it was voted out because of massive, disgusting corruption. There's the 1MBD, some scandal. Basically, there was an economic development fund that had literally billions of dollars just go missing. And the prime minister himself sort of walked off with $700 million, apparently, something like that. Just like staggering, horrific corruption. And the Malaysian people just sort of voted him out. And it's voted out the party bureaucracy that has run the country for the past half century. So it's a tremendous step forward for democracy. It's a tremendous step forward for Malaysia. It's a great thing. This is a Muslim country that a lot of people in the United States want to tell you is incapable of democracy. That's generally how I think of most people who take that approach to Islam. Not to say that Malaysia hasn't had some interesting issues and problems with more sort of Salafi jihadist, hardcore Muslim folks. But anyway, I'm getting away from myself. So basically, you had a tremendously corrupt elite that was running Malaysia, and it got kicked out on its ass. I think this is part of a larger trend in sort of general U.S. geopolitics discussion. It's become very fashionable to talk about, it's democracy is failing, democracy is falling apart. What are we going to do? And of course, this supports. You notice the way that this plays in and supports what I've been talking about today. The way that it supports this idea that the world is dangerous and we need our noble aristocratic military class to save us from this world where democracy is falling. But once again, like these examples of places where democracy is failing are actually places that are the result of U.S. politics and U.S. policy. The biggest examples would be Russia. Putin has, come to power, has been in power for quite some time, but has been able to consolidate his power largely because of U.S. actions in terms of expanding NATO, supporting the coup in Ukraine in 2014. It was 2014, right? Yes, we convinced the Russians that they needed a nasty dictator. The other big example is Erdogan. I've made videos talking about the way that Erdogan would not have been able to take the power he has taken if it were not for the war in Syria that the United States created. And the other big example is Hungary's Viktor Orban, who was present and unpleasant and unhelpful prior to the war in Syria, but he was sort of reaching his sell-by date until the refugee crisis that the United States created with its war in Syria hit a high pitch in 2015, and he got a sort of new lease on life by being the happy racist European dictator. All of these examples are examples that we created. I've also talked about just recently, and I think it was one of the China videos I did in the past month or two, I talked about how the idea that China isn't getting more democratic is another freaking myth. So I think this Malaysia thing is really interesting, and I think very worth going into, because it's not just Malaysia. I mean, we got Malaysia, we've got in the past month, we've got Malaysia, we've got Armenia. In the past year, we've got not as up on it as it should be, but I believe both Romania and Bulgaria, at least in the past 5 years, have kicked out corrupt, nasty leaders. We have in the past year seen the fall of Jacob Zuma, very corrupt prime minister of South Africa. We've seen after almost 40 years, we saw the fall of Robert Mugabe, and admittedly the system that he leaves in Zimbabwe is not, Switzerland, and has certainly experienced a lot of damage, but Mugabe's freaking gone. I mean, that's pretty magical. And as an article I was reading just today pointed out, like even Erdogan, Orban, and even Putin to a degree, these people that are just sort of uncritically described as vicious, horrible dictators, they actually, Orban to the highest degree, Erdogan to a lesser degree, and Putin to the least degree, still rely on democratic legitimacy. I mean, these folks throw elections all the time, and they're not, they are corrupted, they are not free and fair, but they're not, sort of Assad, Pinochet style, fake plebiscites either. These folks are not winning by 99% all the time. There's definitely interference with the elections, but these are not, Mussolini or Hitler style dictatorships, despite the fact that the U.S. foreign policy establishment talks about them that way. So yes, I think focusing more on these incredible examples of steps forward, like what we saw in Malaysia, is very much worth doing. Fatel Guetta asks, thoughts on Japan discovering rare earth minerals. I think that is great. I think the subtext of what Fatel is asking here, Fatel, am I pronouncing that right? Is it Fatel? I think what the subtext here is that China has recently had tremendous control over rare earth metals that are vital for the manufacturing of certain electronics. I think they're really important in cell phones, might also be very important in electronic batteries. Maybe somebody in the comments who's good with for electric car batteries and stuff, maybe somebody in the comments who knows that stuff better can let me know. But rare earth minerals, tremendously important, and as their name might indicate, are rare. And China actually has some of the most easily accessed bits. My understanding, I remember reading articles recently, is that there are sources in other places, they're just harder to exploit. So a recent news item was that this stranglehold that China had on rare earth minerals was actually kind of blown out of the water by Japan. Now, I don't know what the timeline on that is. I mean, Japan has discovered vast new source of rare earth minerals. That's great. That's great news. But does that mean that this is stuff that they can just start scooping out of the ground next week? I probably doubt it. They definitely can. I'm sure I think that a lot depends on like what the lead time is here. Is this something that they're going to develop? You know, it's going to take them 10 years of construction to develop, or is it something that's going to take them 2 years of construction to develop? But it is nice to see that rare earth mineral, monopoly that China had dissipate. Though I think that was always kind of oversold. I think it was sort of something. I can't remember. There was a large rare earth deposit in the United States that I think wasn't being accessed because the environmental consequences were a bit too high. Something like that. It could very well be that. Once again, I'm not a geologist. Or an engineer. It could very well be that the rare earth metals that were discovered in Japan are found to have the same thing. I mean, Japan takes its environment quite seriously, so maybe that's a similar situation there. I don't know. Elvis Boycott Israeli Products asks my prediction for North Korea. My prediction for North Korea is the same that it's been the whole time. And is the reason that I have not made any videos on North Korea, despite the fact that seems to be CNN's, for the quarter of the day that CNN is not covering Trump Russia garbage. They're covering North Korea, and I think it's completely pointless. I think that nothing is really going to change there. I think it's lovely that. I believe is it President Moon? No, that's not. Anyway, I think it's lovely that South Korea has a president that is oriented towards sort of peace and cooperation and whatnot. And who knows? Maybe Trump's actions had something to do with getting a new photo op. And I think that North Korea and South Korea talking together is great. But we've had these photo ops before. We've had these programs before. Kim Jong-un now has nukes. And the idea that he's ever going to give those up are fantasies for idiot children like our president. And the reason I haven't made any videos on North Korea is because I don't think this is going to move much. I don't think it's going to move at all. I think that this is, once again, as we do with every new president, this is like a whole new round of sound and fury signifying absolutely nothing. Mahmoud Mahfouz asks, what are your thoughts on IMF and the World Bank and how they fund and support the corrupt leaders in the third world? I honestly am a lot more concerned with the actions of arms companies as far as funding and corrupt leaders in the third world. Like I had mentioned with the Niger thing earlier on, this idea that our guys who were probably initially acting as a sales force for some weapon system are now out in the Niger bush killing That's probably not the appropriate use of the term Bush. But out killing folks that the local strongman tells us is ISIS. It doesn't really. That's the kind of thing I really worry about. I think that there's a whole strain of commentary that doesn't really make much sense to me. Or maybe I'm a little biased. In Istanbul, I was friends with a lot of people who worked for the World Bank, and it's filled with people who legitimately think that they're doing a good job in helping people. There are certainly aspects of that are not true. My critique of the World Bank and IMF is actually a little more oriented towards the amount of money that's spent on paying for rich world people to go glamorous places. That's something that bothers me more. But the IMF and the World Bank were initially conceived as economic stabilization entities with like kind of an altruistic approach. And some of the ideologies they impose, some of the approaches to restructuring debt and what an economy should do, like might be overly, I don't know, neoliberal or Anglo-Saxon economics or blah, blah, blah. But I'm generally a supporter of that sort of thing. And I honestly think that to the extent that the IMF and the World Bank have built the world we have today, which I find to be quite miraculous, they're good organizations. And I'm sure, is John watching today? I'm sure there are people who can throw up a lot of really good examples where IMF and certainly Greece. I think Greece has been abused very seriously, and IMF, World Bank is part of that, but it's mostly the Germans. I'm sure people can throw up individual examples where the IMF, the World Bank has done some like horrific stuff, but I'm generally for multilateral institutions. I totally am well aware that these institutions, like the United Nations, honestly, even a little bit, the European Union, were sort of put together for U.S. benefit. But I also believe that institutions can evolve beyond that and, can actually do a better job of living up to their high-minded ideals than they do at their outset. And obviously, I'm thinking of the U.S. Constitution, a document that I take very seriously and I'm very proud of, and consider to be at the root of my sense of myself as an American. Had racism and slavery codified in it. I don't think they mentioned the word slavery, but it actually said in there that African Americans were 3/5 of a person. And it had a lot of high-minded ideals, but was used to perpetuate horrors for quite some time. And then it eventually grew and evolved beyond that. And I think that the IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations, and other organizations, the World Trade Organization, have the capability to evolve into the actual high-minded ideals that are written down in their charters. And I think they're already doing that to a degree. So I'm not like a knee-jerk IMF World Bank opponent. Can Pakistan actually destroy Israel in 12 minutes like they claim? I don't know what Pakistan's missile stuff looks like. I don't know what. Honestly, I'd actually be interested, because of Pakistan's location next to India. I would imagine they haven't been able to test a lot of long-range missile technology, just because of how I don't know that to be the case. That's just something that pops into my head. So I kind of wonder if Pakistan has ever sent a missile that far. So I don't know. Interesting. Interesting question. But once again, I mean, Pakistan is, I'd say, arguably a much scary. I'm sorry, I have people in Pakistan. Is a much scarier place than Iran is, and they have a nuclear weapon. And neither India nor Israel has gotten nuked, because people with nukes don't nuke people. They have it for their security. Siobhan's 2008 Nochial points out that third world term is not viable now. I think that's actually a very that's a very key point, and I should probably not be using that term, but I'm a terrible person and a racist, so I still do kind of use that. But you're right, I should try to work that out of the way that I refer to things. Not that the idea of the third world ever made any sense at all. It is sort of a shorthand that could mean a million different things, and imprecise terminology is a bad thing. So I should probably avoid it. I was in Algiers, the capital of Algeria, a while back, and I was bummed because the Third World bookstore, which is apparently somewhat world famous, was closed. So I think it is worth pointing out that this whole third world terminology doesn't just have like sort of pejorative connotation. It's not just a negative thing. It's also a term that has been sort of owned by people in a amusing way. Though, yeah, as a white guy from the United States, live casting from Upper Manhattan, I probably shouldn't be using the term third world in 2018. I will try to avoid it. Let's see. Farzam asks, why is Turkey's currency at an all-time low like this? Any predictions its future given the recent and coming events? So Turkey has been like, I sort of understand what people tell me about currencies and Forex and this, that, and the other thing, but like my ability to speak sensibly about it is not high. So you should definitely take this with a grain of salt. But what I've gotten from reading Bloomberg and other sources is for almost half a decade now, if not before, Turkey's sort of macroeconomic picture, for lack of a better word, like debt levels, not just for the government, but also for corporate, for businesses and for the mass public. Debt levels in Turkey have been just off the charts. Like their macroeconomic performance is insane. Central banks should generally be independent. That's like one of the just basic like running a sensible economy 101 in Turkey. But it's Turkey, and Erdogan has exerted more and more power over everything in the country. So you've got folks at the Turkish Central Bank who are afraid. They're still nominally independent, I believe, but they're less likely to do what's necessary to protect the currency because Erdogan has decided that inflation happens when you raise interest rates, which is completely against what every economist says and hundreds of years of experience running economies. Now, because Erdogan, and this is something I might actually make a video about recently at some point, because I've been thinking about it a lot in the context of the United States and the Trump bump for the stock market. The fact that the stock market's done very well since Trump was elected is like the role that confidence plays in an economy, the role that the way that an economy can keep going or a market can do well as long as the people participating in that market believe it should continue to do well. So while everybody in the international financial community has been like, holy shit, Turkey is about to fall to pieces in a really bad way. Everybody has been saying that for 5 years, just in terms of their sovereign debt, their approach to interest rates, their approach to central banking. They've been insisting that to the point where I'm like, well, we're kind of in boy who cried wolf territory. It's like, okay, yeah, you've been saying this. And even before 2013, since I've been involved with Turkey, there have been flashing warning signs for almost a decade now about the Turkish economy. And nothing has happened. And I think that a lot like this sort of Trump bump to the U.S. stock market that largely happened because a lot of people who actually make decisions about what happens with the stock market identify with Trump. They seem happier, with Trump than with, some African Muslim college professor. That's why I think the stock market has done so well. Erdogan's sort of power with the Turkish business community and also with the Turkish public has allowed his insistence that everything is fine to make everything fine. He's sort of created a reality in which basic macroeconomic policy doesn't make sense. It doesn't have to make sense. But and that's the, you know, it's fascinating. Like I think after 2008, nobody insists that markets are efficient or rational anymore. But I think we still undersell the extent to which it's all just fucking confidence games and ridiculousness. And if you are a accomplished bullshitter and have power over your people and media, as Erdogan does, you can keep the party going, even though, you know, it's like Wile E. Coyote running out over the chasm. You know, like he runs off a cliff and then he keeps running for a little while until he realizes that he's run off the cliff. But it's when the realization actually hits him that it goes plummeting down. And I think we might be reaching sort of a Wile E. Coyote moment for the Turkish economy. I think that may be the issue here. So yeah, there's that, which is not great for Turkey. So I don't know. Forsen says, any comments about Armenia would be awesome. Armenia is something I should be looking into more, but it's really cool, is my understanding. Sort of Russian affiliated oligarch type strongman guy who'd been running Armenia for 10 years or longer than that, I'm not sure, tried to pull a Putin, you know, tried to switch from one office to another office. Like, I don't know exactly what it was, a president, a prime minister. And the people marched and kicked him out. And he had to resign. It's a fantastic thing. And it's also very interesting, sort of thinking about it from like a geopolitical thing. Like it's, you know, this is what sort of an actual, you know, public protest movement looks like, as opposed to what happened in Ukraine, which I believe was actually a lot more U.S. supported. You know, because I believe in such crazy conspiracy theories as the fact that U.S. Senator John McCain was marching with fucking Ukrainian protesters. Anyway, sorry, that I don't need to go down that rabbit hole. But yeah, Armenia is another amazing thing, and another example of what I was talking about, where democracy is actually doing much, much better than we are told. It's only where U.S. policy is most powerful that democracy is falling apart. Unfortunately, beyond that, I don't really know enough about the Armenia situation. There are many things that I wish I had been reading more about, but I just don't know. I don't know how stable that is. I don't know. I do know that it's looking likely that Russia is not going to intervene in any way, which is fantastic. So yeah, I don't know. But yeah, Armenia, very cool. Fadel. Okay. Thank you, Fadel. Sorry, Fadel. Fadel Guetta. I'll pronounce it that way. Thanks. Okay. Questions. Do we have any questions? Yes. Brent has hit $80 per barrel. Ask Logo Cool Extreme. Do you stand by your Saudi Arabia videos? I do stand by my Saudi Arabia videos. I think when it gets to 100, if it gets to $110 a barrel, then I'll feel the need to revise. It is, this $80 oil is something that Donald Trump has given to us. If you're going to threaten, was it $3 to $4 million barrels of oil a day in terms of exports from Iran, then something like this is going to happen. I do not expect oil to stay at this level for very long. I think that people are dramatically overestimating the U.S. ability to stop oil from coming from out of Iran. What the United States can do with its sanctions is basically kill any kind of interesting new economic development in Iran, despite the fact that France and is it Germany? France and the UK, at least, are trying desperately to save the Iran deal. French companies have been piling out of Iran over the past couple of weeks. Total, whatever, the French oil company bailed because they don't listen to what their government says. They have to get financing in the world market, and that means a lot of financing from U.S. banks. So no matter what their government decides, it doesn't matter. French companies are leaving. But the U.S. is not going to be able to, especially in the context of $80 per barrel oil. The United States, I do not believe, is going to be able to make a significant dent in Iran's oil production. The markets right now are sort of assuming they are. And if it does stay at $80 per barrel, I was reading some news stories recently. I mean, India is flipping out. India has had a tremendous 3 or 4 years of growth over the past since the oil price fell in 2014, and having oil back up at this level is not great for them. Which means that for those of us who took microeconomics, that means that the demand curve shifts. This pricing, I believe, is already having an effect on demand, and we're going to see it sink again. I think fairly quickly. The thing that has really screwed up my analysis here is Venezuela. It's extraordinary that the place with the largest oil reserves in the world, is just falling apart. Such an extraordinarily poorly run place. I blame Chavez. I blame Maduro. I blame the elites prior to who were so shitty at running their country that Chavez and Maduro seemed attractive to the majority of the people there. Venezuela is a sad story, and its production is going to continue to plummet. I think the Iran sanctions story is oversold, but what's happening to Venezuela is not. It's really kind of shocking, sad thing to see. And that is really, Venezuela was one of the largest oil exporters in the world, and it's now those exports have fallen by at least half, and are continuing to fall, and the fall may even be accelerating. The fact that we're not at $200 of $200 barrel of oil right now, off of the almost disappearance of Venezuela from the world market, is a sign that what I was saying about oil markets, what I have been saying about oil markets, is actually true. So no, I will not be backing off my Saudi Arabia videos. I stand by that analysis. Wu says, say Despacito 2 is coming soon. I don't understand that. Don't get it. I did go to Puerto Rico recently. That was lovely. Okay, stop what? We have questions. What do you think of Bernard Lewis, who very recently passed away? I know he gets a lot of shit from people for influencing a lot of neocon policies during the Bush administration. I have read and very much enjoyed certain Bernard Lewis books. I think I started one of his more recent books at some point in the past decade and didn't bother finishing it, which is very rare for me, because I just thought it was silly. However, his Emergence of Modern Turkey, that he wrote, I believe, in the 50s, has been superseded by sort of more, if you want the text on modern Turkey, obviously you want something that's been written more recently than 50 years ago. But that book is fantastic, and I think did a tremendous amount to make me more informed about Turkey, what was going on in Turkey. It's outdated. It's some of the language is of course inappropriate to our delicate modern ears. But yeah, Bernard Lewis's Emergence of Modern Turkey is fantastic. People get old and they do stupid shit. I don't know if it was Jeet here, a guy I follow on Twitter, or maybe he just retweeted something that somebody else said, but it sort of pointed out that this is actually a well-worn path for sort of really brilliant historians and political scientists or whatnot. It's just sort of go off the rails into sort of decrepit, get off my lawn racism as they get older. I mean, he's a very, very old man. Bernard Lewis was a very, very old man, even at the start of the Iraq War, which he supported. Like another great example would be Samuel Huntington, who has a lot to do with the way that people see the world. But then he's got this clash of civilizations thesis that people talk about all the time. That actually is it, I believe, I haven't read the book, but my understanding is that as it was initially conceived, it was actually a much more nuanced, sort of clever, thing that sort of talked about, like, okay, look, like, these sort of cultural, political issues between China, the United States, Europe, the Middle East, Africa. These are going to be important things going forward. We shouldn't underestimate that. Like, that was his initial thesis. And then by the time he was, leading up to the years of his death, his class of civilizations, his new class of civilization books had sort of been like devolved into Muslims. I hate some Muslims. And that's, this happens, people get old and decrepit and less worth listening to. I can see that beginning to happen in myself. Anyway, not quite there, but there. And more seriously, I see stuff like that in my family. Like I see people whose opinions I used to really respect and took as a guide just become less serious. It's one of the saddest things about human life. We sort of return to infancy. So anyway. Okay, question from Fruitba. Do you know of Israel test? Why Israeli officials are always telling, and the U.S. media telling Americans what their foreign policy be and just justifying their crimes? I had talked of, I've talked about this, I think actually earlier today. I'd recommend that Medium post that I did a while back. I'll put it in the comments, talking about the real relationship between the United States and Israel. I would actually say that there are certain officials in the Israeli government, like Netanyahu, that are basically just bought and paid U.S. stooges. These folks exist to make the world less stable, so the United States can sell more guns. I think that the whole causation chain is just backwards here. I keep harping on this. I think I talked about this in the last live stream, but the fact that the head of the IDF, the head of the Israeli Defense Forces, the guy who's responsible for the safety and security of Israel, wanted to keep the Iran deal. I think that alone should make you think a little, if you're a Zionist, should make you think a little harder about Netanyahu and his utility towards Israeli safety and security. I maintain he's probably one of the bigger threats to Israel's continued. Israel's probably is the biggest threat to Israel's continued existence today. But anyway, Israeli influence is powerful in the West. I think that's backwards, but whatever. Not going to solve that today. Chelik Adam says, hi, Rob. I said, well, hello, Chelik Adam. Okay. Why is Europe so horrendous in assimilating its immigrants, unlike America? That's a great question from Local Extreme. Man, it's, I don't know, man. I think just not having to do it for quite some time. I think the British are getting slightly better at it. I think the Germans actually are getting better at it. I think it's going to be kind of fascinating to see how this large Arab population interacts with the Turkish population that's been there for 50 years now, to some degree, depending, and obviously with variations. What I've seen in the United States is early on in the United States, to end fucking today, the United States is terribly brutal to the first people who get there. You've all seen Gangs of New York, that Martin Scorsese film. There were gangs who would go out and brutalize Irish people, in the 1800s, because the Irish weren't welcome. They were a mongrel race. And that's been, that cycle is repeated over and over again. We've got a really disgusting situation in the United States going on right now with the immigration customs enforcement folks just basically running around like a Gestapo. You can see stories every day on Twitter if you're interested. Verified stories with real news outlets that are shared on Twitter. Let me be clear about that. Depending on the media bubble that you're in, we have U.S. government people detaining people for speaking Spanish all over the country. It's disgusting. I think everybody is brutal to the new immigrant group. That's just normal. What'll be interesting to see in Germany is it's no longer just the Germans versus the Turks. Is it now going to be the Germans and the Turks versus the new arrivals? Or rather the Germans and the Germans and the Turkish Germans whose Turkish fades a bit as they sort of ally on how they think things should be run. And sort of start to victimize the new guy, because that's one of the saddest things about human nature, is like nothing really brings people together like victimizing somebody else. So that's sort of it'll be interesting to see that start happening in European countries, because I think immigration. I do think there are some structural issues. I think the fact that the more developed welfare states make people even more resentful of newcomers. There's also the fact that a lot of those countries are based on these really shitty blood and soil ideas of nationhood, like the German blood. Obviously, the Germans don't talk about that quite so much anymore, but I think there's a lot of that sort of underpinning it, and there's problems like that. But I think the biggest problem for European acceptance of immigrants is the fact that it's so new, the fact that it's such a new thing for them to deal with, and I think that makes a rather large deal. Okay. Well, let's see here. Questions. How are you? Jesper Clausen asks, what are your views on the immigration problem for Germany and Sweden, the coming Swedish election in September? You know what? I'm embarrassed to admit I did not even know that there was a Swedish election going on in September. There's certain like North European elections that I just sort of like, I'm like, it's not going to be important. And that could be completely wrong. You know what? I could be shocked. The Swedish Nazi Party could win in September, and I'd have no idea, because I really don't know that much about Swedish politics, despite spending a fair amount of time there. My general view on the another example would be the German election. I mean, yeah, AfD did well. Yes, Merkel had to get involved in a coalition, this, that, and everything. But I'm just sort of like, the Germans are probably going to sort things out. It probably doesn't merit a video at this point. But yeah, Germany and Sweden. Yeah, I am not a catastrophist when it comes to immigration to Germany and Sweden. I think Germany and Sweden have probably positioned themselves to. Not that they weren't already positioned to be. I think by taking in all these people, I think Germany and Sweden have positioned themselves to be even more dominant in the European continent in the coming decades than they already have been. I think they are, sort of leaders. Germany is, arguably the leader of Europe. And Sweden, despite being much smaller, is a fascinating place. Been lucky enough to I did a TEDx talk there a couple of years back, and been there for a couple weddings. It's super expensive, but it's a lovely, lovely place that has figured a lot out. And I think what Germany and Sweden did this time around is they figured out the next step as well, and just sort of did the basic math and said, we need more freaking people. You can argue, once again, taking the approach of like the most anti-Islamic, anti-refugee news sources. You know what? Like, because I've seen some very dubious statistics talking about like, 40% of the new migrants can't actually work. It's like, what, really? Like a year later, they haven't figured out how to speak Swedish or German? Fuckers. But yeah, like even if that were true, like for the entire lives of those migrants, they're going to have kids, and those kids are going to speak Swedish and German, and those kids are going to be contributing to German and Swedish retirement accounts. It's I think it's a very savvy move. You always get nasty news stories in the first years of a large migration, but what the Germans and the Swedish have done here, I think, is incredibly savvy for long-term power and economic viability. I think that was my attitude towards immigration problem in Germany and Sweden is that it's not a problem. And also, I know for some people who watch a lot of Fox News, you've got this description, you've got this vision of Germany and Sweden as this sort of horror show. It's just a myth. I've been to both these places. Spent almost a week in Sweden and 3 or 4 cities in 2016. In 2017, I went and did Oktoberfest. So I was part of one of those big groups of people that are supposedly mobbed by these horny Middle Eastern kids, and it's just all bullshit. These places are fine. There are no-go areas. There's a lot of just fantasy around this. I think what Germany and Sweden have done was very clever. So, anyway. Let's see. Why Israeli officials are always in the media telling American what their foreign policy for and justifying their crimes? Because Israeli officials are owned by us. That's quite simple. Israeli officials work for the U.S. investor, which includes me as someone who owns some broad-based exchange-traded funds that try to replicate the performance of the market. Like, I don't personally own any defense contractors, but if I own a broad-based ETF, I am absolutely benefiting from defense contractors. So yeah, the Israeli officials work for me, is what it is. Okay. Why can't Europe assimilate immigrants as good as the U.S.? I think I covered that already. I think it's because it's new. Let's see, questions. Will Trump implement the TPP to hurt the Chinese economy? I'm actually, as Fidel Guetta, I'm actually pretty against the TPP. I think the TPP is kind of racist. I think that the TPP, I've got a video. You can just search Mo Freedom Foundation. TPP is super racist. I think this idea, both the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the TTIP, the version for the Atlantic, is basically just a way to cut most of the world out of the WTO that was sold to the developing world as providing this level playing field for everybody, and it's just a way to create a smaller club. And yes, it was designed to hurt the Chinese economy. But no, I mean, Trump is the only thing Trump seems to be loyal to is stupid shit that he said in the past. So yeah, I don't think Trump's going to implement the TPP. I don't think he has anybody working in his administration that has the mental capacity or organizational capacity to implement the TPP. People are clowns. Freud, I can never pronounce Freud. It's a real problem of mine. Fraud. Anyway, Frodba asks, have you been in Algiers? You have been in Algiers. What do you think of it? Is it close to Venezuela? I think Algiers is amazing. It was a fascinating place to be. It's the only place I've been as an expat where the language is still French, which was really awkward because my French is garbage. J'oublie tout mon français. But it was a fascinating place to be. It felt like what I imagined East Germany must have felt like. They've still got checkpoints everywhere. It's the streets are named after Che Guevara and Frantz Fanon, and it's crazy. I was very lucky to go there in a sort of absurd capacity. A guy I'd gotten to know in Istanbul was sort of there in a quasi-diplomatic role, so really got like it probably would have been a difficult place to visit if I wasn't hanging out with somebody who had diplomatic status. But yeah, it was an incredible place. Went on a long road trip, went to out in the Sahara, probably the best vacation I've ever taken, back in 2013. It was really an extraordinary thing to do, sort of a peak life experience. And has also meant that I have trouble at the U.S. border. Actually, no, it seems to have finally dissipated. But it also meant that I got stopped and got a 45-minute interview at the U.S. border every time I crossed the U.S. border for about 3 years. But it was totally worth it. It's totally worth it. And now, the people at customs have got a full file on me and ask me how my YouTube channel is doing when I sit down with them, which is, fine. Anyway, yeah, Algeria is great. I recommend it highly, though it is a bit hard for Americans to go to. What do you think about Algeria? You've been there. Will the U.S. win the trade war with China? Yes, in the short term. Long term, no. Yeah, I think people tend to underestimate U.S.'s short-term power, but I think they also tend to underestimate the damage that not just Trump, but also Obama and Bush did to that power in the long term. Trump is already, with the Iran deal stuff, abusing Europe in terms of, once again, the sanctions for that are not sanctions against Iran. They're sanctions against Europe for doing business with Iran. So what's important here isn't really necessarily the fact that the U.S. is abusing, the rest of the world. If you look at the videos I've got on FATCA, F-A-T-C-A, you'll see that as long as it's well hidden, the U.S. can do whatever it wants because of its control of sort of banking, finance controls and whatnot. The problem with what's going on with the Iran deal right now is it is very publicly telling Europe you don't have any sovereignty. So I think that that's going to lead to some long-term damage. I also think that the U.S. approach to China, while in the short term, China just has to go like, I give up. I think in the long term, this means that China, Europe, the rest of the world is going to think harder about getting out from under the United States thumb. So, Farzam says, you usually say U.S. is using Israel, not the other way around. However, U.S.'s support of Israel has a lot of benefits for Israel while it's toxic for the U.S. How do you put them together? Well, the question is, what do you see as the U.S. interest? If you see what I see as the U.S. interest in terms of like peace, stability, the maintenance of this world system for as long as possible, with us on top where it sort of fades away in a nice way, then absolutely, you're totally right. Israel's policies are not at all helpful for that and like super damaging. But if you look at U.S. policy, U.S. goals, the way that Washington, D.C. defines those goals, Israel's fantastic because instability is what, the wise old men in Washington, D.C. want because it's instability that guarantees their jobs. Yeah, I think that's just to sort of assume that Israel acts against U.S. interests is, I think, to misunderstand the extent to which U.S. interests are not the interests of U.S. people, of the U.S. people. And, but to the extent that, I think they say 50% of the U.S. public has some exposure to sort of U.S. equity markets and the stock market, owns a chunk of that. Yeah, Israel's helpful for that. Helps us sell more guns. All right. Questions. Will Trump win in 2020? Ask for Roger Ruff. Man, I hope not. I have this hunch that that the Democrats are going to not get anything together and are just going to be sort of a disaster, but they're not going to be running Hillary Clinton. That I can say with great confidence. And I think that was the main factor and a really undersold factor in Donald Trump's winning. I also think that even though Trump won't have put, even though the Democrats won't have put together an attractive program or any kind of messaging other than we're not Trump, I think that'll probably do very well. And I think there are probably pretty large shifts that are going to go on in Texas and Florida. I think there are actually large shifts that are already happening in those places because, Texas is tremendously reliant on NAFTA. And if Trump actually does something to threaten that, then yeah, I think then 2020 probably becomes the year that Texas shifts. I don't think Trump's going to win in 2020, but I didn't think it was going to win in 2016 either. Now, did I? And I sure fucked that up. So who knows? Iran and China will form an alliance, says Stan Cormier, and I say no, they won't. Borders are important things. Actually, in was that this spring or was that last fall? Iran, sorry. I'm sorry. I was reading that as India and China. Actually, yeah, no, Stan, you're right. Sorry. Iran and China forming an alliance. There's a possibility. Actually, well, China's definitely going to keep buying Iran's oil. Definitely. No questions. Um, no questions. And so's India, and so's honestly probably Europe. Actually, that's the only way they'll be able to assert themselves. All their companies will have to get out of Iran because of U.S. financing. Um, as far as like Iran and China forming like an alliance, I don't think we're quite there yet. Like maybe in the 2030s, but not quite. Thoughts on China? Fidel Gueda asks, thoughts on China wanting to build a channel through the Malay Peninsula. I am really freaking pro Chinese infrastructure. I think it's amazing that they're doing a Marshall Plan like times 10 for the entire world. I think that I'm excited to see what the potential that has for Pakistan, for everywhere. Just talking about the general Belt and Road project. Um, I I don't know why they would build a channel through the Malay Peninsula, but I don't see why not. If that makes transit quicker, I'm sure there's terrible environmental consequences, but I don't know much about that specific project, and I am a huge fan of. Um, I am a huge fan of Chinese infrastructure. It's all over the world. I think it's great. Logo Cool Extreme asks, will Benjamin Netanyahu and the Likud party lose like Malaysia's BN party in Najib? I don't know, honestly. That'd be nice. Who is a potential Democratic candidate? I agree. Hillary lost. Trump didn't win, says Faraj Araf. Who is a potential Democratic candidate? I mean, Sanders says he's going to run, but like I saw something he's going to run, but he's not going to. He's going to refuse the nomination just to try and pull people left. Okay, whatever. I mean, Cory Booker's going to run. Kamala Harris is going to run. As far as who I like, I don't generally like Democrats, but I mean, Kamala Harris strikes me as interesting, though she was a prosecutor for a while, and I really don't like prosecutors. But I like the idea of a woman of color for president. I think, unfortunately, sort of motivating the Democratic coalition that doesn't really stand for anything, really at all, sort of requires a person of color now. I think there may be some truth to that. So Cory Booker or Kamala Harris, basically anybody other than Trump. Who else is running? That's interesting. I don't know. I made a video I think on November 3rd saying I don't want to talk about 2020. We should be focusing on what's happening now and how we can improve things now. And yeah, in May of 2018, I sure don't want to be talking about 2020 yet. I have my one little Texas theory that I sort of sneak out there, but yeah, I'm not interested in the horse race politics, and I won't be covering it unless, of course, people ask me in live chats. I will, of course, be covering the 2020 U.S. election in 2020, starting January 1st or what have you. But I don't want to. I mean, last election cycle, I was making videos about the 2016 election and early 2014. That's crazy. Emantas Verenikas, apologies for pronunciation, asks, does the USA view India as its ally? I think we do increasingly. I think it was a Bush choice that actually wasn't the worst. I actually think it was. It may actually still have been the worst. India and Pakistan both violated the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Sorry, I'm not 100% sure they were signatories, but they both developed nuclear weapons, and that was really freaking not cool. And they both suffered sanctions because of that. And then Bush sort of went back on all that and was like, what, screw it, India, we're pals. I think that probably was the right strategic decision because we're very invested in strategic competition with China. But yeah, I would say that India and the United States are growing closer. I mean, never fully opposed, but not good, not very cooperative during the Cold War era. India sort of very consciously was sort of anti-U.S. power or what have you. So yeah, I think India and the United States are growing closer as far as ally. I don't know. That's a It's a loaded term. And Shivansh, 2018, does not think that India is a U.S. ally. Ross asks, what do you think of the South China Sea situation? I honestly think it's a response to the pivot to Asia. I think it was a sort of response to U.S. aggression, frankly. Though, as with Russia, the United States can take all kinds of actions against people that want to take actions against that don't really look like aggression because we're that powerful. The TPP was a great example, aimed directly at China's sort of life's blood trade, designed to sort of carve that away from China. There was the opening military base in Australia, and I think most importantly, there was the sort of carving Myanmar out of the Chinese sphere of influence and into the U.S. sphere of influence. And that sort of stuff made a tremendous impact in China, much larger than we sort of saw. So I think the South China Sea thing, while it's sort of a dumb, belligerent thing to do, I think is actually kind of a desperate attempt to save face after the U.S. sort of kicked China around quite a lot. So yeah, I'm not too angry about the South China Sea stuff. I just think it's an indicator of the way that U.S.-China relations are going, and not a good one. Mustafa Tanritaner asks, hi, do you think Erdogan will win again? And if he loses, do you see a civil war within Turkey? I do not see a civil war if he loses. I do not see him losing, actually. I think he's probably going to win this upcoming election in June, which is a shame. But hey. All right, McBail has told me that India and Pakistan never signed the Treaty on the Nuclear Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. Okay. We still don't like people having nukes. Is that true? They really didn't sign the NPT? Anyway. Omid Pakbaz asks, what is the main goal of Trump for restraining sanctions on Iran? Trump's main goal with sanctions on Iran is looking impressive to Fox and Friends. There's no, and also no. It's also in service to the U.S. military-industrial complex. They hated the Iran deal, not because of the fact that it made the world safer from nuclear weapons. They didn't really care about that one way or the other. What the sort of U.S. foreign policy establishment hated was the promise of the Iran deal, the idea that relations with Iran could be regularized. Iran and the United States could, possibly become, never friends, but better able to deal with each other. That Iran could become a normal country. That is terrifying to the U.S. foreign policy establishment because it's one of the only enemies we got left. It's one of the only things that justifies our attempt to sort of go be military everywhere. So yeah, he's sort of acting in service to his dumb right-wing constituency and also to the war party, which is everybody. Yep. Okay, do you think China and Russia are real or temporary allies? Ask Amantis Veronicus. Very temporary. I've got a video called something like Russia will join the EU within 30 years. I'm not sure the EU is going to be there in 5 years, but Russia will be oriented more towards Europe within the next 30 years, for sure, unless they're fucking morons. The China-Russia alliance or partnership or whatnot, that's not an alliance or partnership. It's Russia's ability to be like a stand. Russia is applying to be a satellite. It'll be a relationship that isn't as dignified and respect winning as the UK relationship with the United States. I say that with the full knowledge that the UK's relationship with the United States is embarrassing and what's the word? Degrading. And that would be what Russia's relationship to China and a long-term alliance would be, except much, much worse. Because the Chinese don't have any real affinity for the Russians, and there's actually chunks of Russia that were taken away from China later than Hong Kong. So, yeah, I don't think that China-Russia alliance has any long-term viability. I think short-term politics and the fact that they, at this point in their development, they're both very big into sovereignty and sort of support each other at the UN. I don't think that's not a long-term development, at least not if Russian policy planners have any sense. So, Logo Cool Extreme asks, why does China have so many enemies? Because they're big. Because they're big, and up until the past 30 or 40 years or so, they've been weak. So they haven't really, whereas the United States has been big and sort of strong. We've had a lot of money, cultural weight to bribe people with. And also, we've been distant in a way that China isn't. Sort of Canada, Mexico, lovely places, lovely countries, but, they're not really competitors and never have been. They don't pose any kind of threat to the United States, so the United States doesn't pose much of a threat to them. China, however, has borders with Russia, India, Vietnam, North Korea, and through them, sort of South Korea, Japan, other countries that have a lot to prove and have a lot of very firm ideas about their role as world powers and the way that might conflict with China. So it just sort of, a rising power can make a lot of enemies, and it has. And Brazil, it's a good example. Logo Extreme says, Brazil is big. It doesn't have any enemies. It has, actually. It has had clashes with other countries in Latin America. There have been fewer. Brazil is big, but, honestly, with the exception of the coasts, that big border is, I understand. I mean, it's mostly rainforest, I believe. And historically, it just hasn't been very, very close. These borders, the extent to which the, sort of South America is kind of a different animal. And much like the United States and Canada and Mexico, Brazil is a lot larger than most of its neighbors. So it's got that sort of, whereas, it's not like China and India, which are, similarly sized right next to each other and aspiring superpowers. Or Russia and China, where Russia, despite the fact that it's the 10th the size of China in population terms, is very large geographically and still has these great power pretensions. So, I think Brazil just has a very different thing. Well, Benjamin Bakhtiari says that I am full of shit. Iran is not last enemy left. Venezuela is. Iran is U.S.'s natural friend and ally. Well, that's actually, I don't think you're really disagreeing with me, man. I'm not saying that Iran is a real enemy. I'm saying that Iran is our last sort of manufactured enemy. It is our last, Iran, with the exception of some hardliners who are, really, in fact, not in fact, but really their best allies are people in the United States like Tom Cotton and Donald Trump. Iran, there's no reason for Iran and the United States to be opposed, no reason at all, other than this history of U.S. policy. So I'm not saying that Iran is some kind of natural enemy, nor is Venezuela. It's a terrible idea. Omar says, it's not because they are oppressive to their own people and their allies in any way. Lack of freedom, for example. I'm not sure what you're talking about, Omar. Are you talking about China? Oh, okay, yeah. You're probably talking about why is China have so many enemies? Yeah, definitely. The oppression of their own people and their allies definitely is an aspect of the way that China is viewed. But I tend to see it as more sort of historical hangover stuff, more sort of interstate competition. Because, if you look at the history of this sort of stuff, South Korea has never been a real big fan of China, but up until the 80s, they were a pretty oppressive autocracy as well, These places, so the same with the Philippines. Vietnam is a nasty, oppressive autocracy today. That's improving, definitely improving. But it's still super anti-China. So it's I think it's a little more to do with the geopolitics of it than the systems. But you're absolutely right. China's oppressive system is another reason people don't like them. Wow. Ross asks, where can I find vampires on the old school RuneScape that are not in the wilderness or Mauritania? That sounds like, is that a video game thing? I don't, if it's after 8-bit Nintendo, I'm no good for video game stuff. Fadel Guetta asks, who do you think the next big scapegoat for the U.S.? As far as next big scapegoat, I mean, we've got some great scapegoats now, Iran, obviously. But I think a more interesting question for me is like, where's the next arena of dumbass war bullshit? Because I do think that the Middle East will eventually, be it 5 years or 10 years from now, like will calm down. I think because enough people are sort of realizing that these Islamist clowns were actually just, U.S. agents, whether or not they're aware of it. And I think that the Middle East is hopefully going to be calming down within the next 10, 15 years. And then I think things are going to move to Africa. Like we're going to start hearing about how important it is to fight Boko Haram or how, the strong man in Niger or Rwanda or something, or, our vital allies that have to be supported. So I think because it's already happening. The U.S. is already tremendously involved militarily in Africa, despite the fact that the U.S. people is largely unaware, and U.S. people are largely unaware, and there's no reason for it. So that's already, so it's not necessarily a new scapegoat, but I think it's going to be, a new arena, and I fear it's going to be Africa. Logoco Extreme asks, should we protect Japan and South Korea from North Korea and China by placing nukes like we did to Germany and Turkey? I don't think that's really necessary anymore. If South Korea nuked somebody, and we can, within the era of ICBMs, like the location of missiles is important and makes it more likely to get there, but I don't think we need to actually place missiles in North Korea. In South Korea and Japan to, and actually, do we not have missiles in Japan? I don't know the details of that. I wouldn't be surprised if we did. Farah Giraffe asks, why is the U.S. media sympathetic to the Palestinian cause all of a sudden? That's actually a really, that's an interesting thing I've been thinking about recently. And that's actually, so a lot of people talk about the way that it's so terrible that the old media approach is dying. And I do think it's like the fact that we're reaching a point where it's just the New York Times and maybe one or two other papers that pays for international journalism is a real problem. The work that I do is tremendously reliant on the real old school journalism institutions and the work that they do. And that's a real problem that's fitting. I believe in that. But also there's this like, it's turning us crazy and nobody knows what to think anymore and da-da-da-da-da-da. And I think that's good. I think I've seen a lot of, through social media, through sort of online platforms, publications and whatnot. I think I see a lot of things that are happening that wouldn't have happened without them. I think marijuana legalization is a great example. Certain candidacies, there's no way there would have been a Trump without a Facebook. But I think that as nasty as this particular manifestation has it been, I do believe in democracy, and I do believe in the idea of sort of more mass ideas. And like the fact that coverage by sort of pro-Israel institutions like the BBC and the New York Times has become just it's a joke on Twitter now. Like you can find big, you can find large Twitter accounts that just like go through like the ways that U.S. news has always been constructed, like, like 62, Palestinians die in clashes. Like, what the hell is clashes? Like, it's like 62 Palestinian, so you have people rewriting it, like 62 Palestinians die in clashes with Israeli sniper bullets. There's all these ways that the news out of the Middle East has been reported in the United States that are now being made to look ridiculous. So this shift in the way that Israel and Palestine are being viewed is similar to the sort of is also part of that breakdown in the established media narrative that gave us Trump, or marijuana legalization, or gay marriage. They're all, some of these things are good, some of these things are bad, but they're all part of the same sort of breakdown in the established narrative. People can very quickly make changes, and that's the most. It used to be one of the most controlled issues, and now you just sort of can't control it anymore. I was surprised last week. I made a video that was highly critical of Israeli policy, and I was worried about that. And I thought I was going to get some pushback. I actually think I think it did get strangled on Facebook. Actually, I think I got a lot less interaction than I normally do, but that was sort of the Facebook algorithm. I have a lot of patrons who are big supporters of Israel, and I got one email. I got one email, and I think I'm having a profitable exchange back and forth on that topic. Yeah, there has been very little pushback for that video, which is surprising, because I think it's an indication of just you can't, in a mass media context, you can't control what people think to the degree that you used to be able to, and that is a serious problem for Israel and the Palestinian issue, because you have a lot of people I didn't watch it, but my understanding from Twitter is that the last Bill Maher show was all about trying desperately. He had a New York Times person on, and they're trying desperately to hold on to that old narrative. There was I did see some money quote. It's the Palestinians planned their protest to match the opening of the embassy. We can't let them get away with it. And it's just what do you mean let them get away with it? It's like we can't let Martin Luther King protest on the national monument. He'd get people's attention. It's just the traditional approach to unthinking support for everything that the Israeli government and military says about the Israeli-Palestinian issue still exists in places like the New York Times, but it looks ridiculous. It looks silly today. You can't have things as unbalanced as what happened last Monday, with 62 people dead in the street, dead by sniper bullets in their own way, is basically what is ostensibly their own country on their side of the border. You can't have that, and try and tell people that it's all fine and good. People are dumb, but they ain't that dumb. So yeah, I think that's changing. I think that's shifting very seriously. That's a real problem for Israel. And to be clear, I'm not a rabid anti-Zionist. I even would, to some degree, still consider myself a bit of a Zionist, and I am a supporter of Israel's right to exist and Israel's right to flourish. And I think the greatest threat to that today is Netanyahu and sort of his policy and approach towards things. It's interesting. Siobhan's 2018 Nadiel says, please don't watch the BBC. They destroyed Indian image. Most British think 1 billion Indians live in poverty. That's interesting, man. BBC is pretty bad. I've come to appreciate that recently, especially in its coverage of Syria. And I can see, with anything that is even plausibly in the British interest, or the US, the British government's interest, the BBC can be relied to hew to that very carefully. Britain was an ally. The United Kingdom was an ally for the United States in the destruction of Syria. So everything's Assad is nasty all the time. And that makes sense, actually, that, of course they want to portray India as sort of poor and benighted to justify what Britain has done to India over the centuries. But I got to say, man, if you think BBC is bad, try going to CNN.com. My God. I think it was about a decade ago when I realized that the only thing on CNN.com was Britney Spears and rednecks killing each other. I had to give up on sort of U.S. headline news. So I do go to the BBC for just sort of the headlines. Last questions. I mean, I've been doing this for 2 hours now, so I think I should probably start winding up. Mehdi Borgi asks, why did Facebook ban the electronic intifada's ad for killing Gaza? Because the electronic intifada really should have watched its keywords. As I said, my thing that just mentioned Gaza, I'm pretty sure it got strangled on Facebook. This is the world that we asked for. People complained about fake news. So now that's actually an interesting story. I wish I could remember the name of the think tank, but everybody was complaining about fake news. So Facebook has now allied with trusted think tanks to choke out any news that is supposedly fake. That would include me. That would include anybody who questions the standard narrative. I can't remember what the exact, I think it was the American Century or American, I can't remember exactly what it was, but there's a particular think tank that a lot of folks were pissed off that Facebook was partnering with because it's like half funded by Saudi Arabia and is like as standard a military industrial complex thing as you can imagine. So yes, thanks to Hillary Clinton supporters mostly whining about fake news, Facebook is now going to start censoring much more intensively. So great job. Great job, resistance. So yeah, something called the electronic intifada. Talking about killings in Gaza is not going to make it far on Facebook anymore, which I think is good for Twitter. Actually, you can actually choose who you follow, and you're more likely to actually see information. Though Twitter is doing some of the same shit now, so I don't know. I guess come see us on YouTube. I don't know. Fidel Guetta has thoughts on Eric Prince. Eric Prince sucks. Yeah, Eric Prince is terrible. The guy who founded Blackwater and now just sort of runs around doing corruption and mercenary nastiness. Yeah, it's sort of the thing is like if James Bond existed, he'd be a really shitty person. I guess that's sort of Eric Prince. So yeah. Faraj Araf asks, when will the U.S. pay for creating Wahhabism Saudi Arabia? Probably never. I mean, 9/11, that sucked. That was because we created Saudi Arabia. Well, let's be clear, the British created Saudi Arabia. We're just responsible for keeping it going for the past 75 years. What do I think of the new sanction Iran? I think it's a terrible fucking idea. Yeah. And I think it sort of, I don't like much about Obama's presidency, but I think that the Iran deal was one of the greatest signs for hope. And it's been crushed. So sad. I'm embarrassed, MK3390, to say that I did not pay any attention to Pompeo's rhetoric from yesterday. I'm going to guess it was belligerent and dumb. Yeah. All right. So thank you so much for listening to all this. I'd love to hear what you thought, maybe in the comments, of what you thought of sort of the spiel I had at the beginning. I mean, I talked for, 45 minutes to an hour about the idea that, actually, no, it was shorter than that. About that sort of general idea of history and whatnot. And I'd love to hear more about that. And just the general idea that's like, wait a second, like, killing people is bad. Why don't more people talk about it? And if you'd like to support me in this mission, I'd suggest checking me out. You can either support me through Patreon or PayPal. They're both linked as suggested by Elvis B and others. I've now linked to PayPal and Patreon in this description right under here. And I'd be very grateful if you consider supporting. This talk that this video started off with sort of grew out of a lot of stuff I'm thinking and writing about in a book that I'm writing and I've been promising for like almost a year now, called Avoiding the British Empire, which will try to apply the lessons from the fall of the British Empire to the U.S. Empire. So hopefully our transition away from primacy can be less damaging and horrific, like to avoid World War III. You can follow me here. Please subscribe. That'd be fantastic. I'm on Instagram as @thegoldenage. I'm on Twitter @RobboLaw. I have a website at www.morefreedomfoundation.com and also a Facebook page. Please find me everywhere. But I'm mostly in the YouTube comments. So yeah, thank you guys for watching all this. I am very grateful. And have a great day. I think I'm going to close this. I'm losing my voice. I've been doing this for 2 hours. You guys are the best. Many thanks.